My number 9 best chess game of the 1920s is absolutely a cheat. I am looking at the Richard Reti versus Max Euwe match from 1920, a 4-game match that was split with 3 games being played before a tournament in Amsterdam and 1 game being played after the tournament. Now, Reti at this time was one of the best players in the world. In fact, he had his best results in 1920 through 1923. And in the 1920s, in addition to his incredible writing about the game and his incredible studies in inventing the Reti opening, he also won a brilliant game against Capablanca, showing his success with his new modern ideas. Sadly, he would also pass away at the young age of 40 before the decade was actually up in 1929. Now, we've talked a lot about Euwe in this particular series, mostly his later games. At this time, he was a very young player, and he was not yet the match of Reti. He was probably like international master strength, while Reti was grandmaster strength. And this first game that we're going to look at, not the only game we're looking at in this match, illustrates Reti's superiority. This game features a classic opening, one of my favorites, the Maxling attack. It begins with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to c4, Italian game, knight f6. And now, if you don't want to play knight g5, which after d5 typically hands black the initiative, you can play pawn to d4, an attempt to claim the initiative. I've done this many times with some success and some very large failures. Now, black can capture here on d4 and white castles. Now, black has 2 choices in this position. Bishop c5 when things are interesting and I think white has very legitimate chances, or knight takes e4 as played by Reti when things look really interesting for just a moment, but actually aren't that interesting. White now pins the knight with rook e1, d5, attacking the bishop on c4 and defending the knight on e4. Bishop takes d5. This is so cool. It's exciting. It's dramatic. Queen takes d5. Knight c3. This move is so awesome. Seriously, part of the reason that I've played this in a lot of games is just because it's so cool to play bishop takes d5 and then knight c3. Like, you're hitting the queen, you're hitting the knight right here. You've got pins on literally both of these pieces. It's so exciting, but it really does simplify quickly after queen a5, and now what should be played, knight takes e4. You're going to get your pawn back on d4, but you're not going to get an advantage out of it. Black can now play bishop e6, and things resolve in a position that's often symmetrical, and white really doesn't get an advantage. I know, I've tried a lot. But after queen a5, Euwe tries something more original. Knight takes d4. He goes for a piece sacrifice, and against a lesser player, maybe this would have worked, but Reti punishes him very severely for this. Knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and no backing down here. Pawn to f5. This move might look risky. It might look like you're opening up your king, but you're hanging on to your piece, and there isn't a way for white to really punish this. For example, you can't play f3 and get your piece back because you can have the knight on e4, but you will lose your queen thanks to this pin right here. Ouchies. So after this excellent move, pawn to f5, white is really struggling. Bishop to g5, going for queen to d8, which is very nice. We like this move. But queen c5. Queen trade, you know, that would be great. Obviously, white's not going for it. Queen d8 check, pushing the king to f7, so the black king does lose castling rights. Knight takes e4, getting a little material back, f takes, and rook d1. You know, all of white's pieces are in the attack, and black's king is on f7, and it seems like no bishop can move, and the rooks are stuck on h8 and a8. I can definitely see looking at this in a blitz game or in a scholastic game or something, and thinking that white's doing pretty well, and maybe this is actually going to work out really well. How can black use the extra material? Well, Reti shows us. He plays the move bishop d6. Excellent defensive technique. Give back a little bit of material to activate your pieces. Queen takes h8 and queen takes g5. Black is really effectively winning in this position with the bishop pair against the white rooks. Now, white should probably just take on h7 right here, and black can finish development, and black is really doing very, very well and is likely to win the game, but the game will continue. Instead, we see f4, which proves to be far too weakening of the white king position here. You know, Euwe is at this point really hoping that anything captures here on f4 so that you can get a pin in this position, or maybe that you can invade or capture on e4 in a better circumstance, but none of that happens, and instead we see queen h4, which is an excellent move. Rook takes e4, and now this is just brilliant. I love this next move so much. Bishop to h3. At this point, Reti has turned this into a double rook sacrifice, which is one of the great kinds of sacrifices in chess. It's on my bucket list to play this in a chess game, and I've never gotten to offer a double rook sacrifice. So queen takes a8 right here, and unfortunately for white, everything is forced from this point on. Bishop c5 check. Now, you can't play king f1 because of queen to f2 checkmate. Very, very pretty. And you also can't block with a rook. It's not just that you're giving back some material and ending up in a pin, it's that after the capture, you can't even recapture because of queen to e1 and immediate checkmate. So after bishop c5 check, the only real option is king h1, but now there's another great move. Great moment to pause your video if you want to find it. It's bishop takes g2. Absolutely, absolutely brilliant move. Now, after bishop takes g2, it's just forced mate in 3. In this position, the king, of course, has to capture. Queen g4 check was played, and then Euwe resigned. The reason is that queen f3 is mating no matter where the king goes. King h1, queen f3 is immediate checkmate. Very pretty. I love the bishop and queen working together here. And if the king goes to f1 instead, we simply get queen to f3 check. The king can go to e1 instead, but now you get kind of the scholar's mate with queen f2 checkmate. So very beautiful win using a double rook sacrifice, but that particular narrative thread does not stop with this game. This game was actually the 4th game played in this particular match, and it was also the only game that was played after the tournament had concluded. All of the other 3 games were played before the Amsterdam tournament, and it was at this point 2 wins to Reti, 1 win to Euwe. Now, the game opens here with pawn to d4, and well, he is a Dutchman, and we should acknowledge that. Euwe goes for the Dutch with pawn to f5, and Reti decides to be aggressive. None of this hyper-modern crap that I'm using to defeat world champions. Instead, we're going for the Staunton Gambit, classical pawn to e4. After pawn e4, we see pawn takes. You really have to accept the challenge. Knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5. And now modern theory really does encourage the move knight to c6, which is a move that I play. It's very interesting. It's also playable for white. The Staunton Gambit is interesting for both sides, but instead we see the move pawn g6. I wouldn't go so far as to say this move is necessarily a mistake, but it probably is an inaccuracy, too slow, and the simple move pawn to f3 is really quite nice now for Reti. So we get pawn takes f3, knight takes f3. At this point, white has really committed to being down a pawn, but white is getting really good development in return for this pawn deficit, and black is going to worry about the king position for the rest of the game. Bishop g7, simple development, bishop d3, and now this is too much. Pawn to c5. Definitely a question mark move here. This is at least some level of a mistake. Now, the best move, or there are a few good moves, but probably the best move is pawn takes c5. Simply capturing, yes, black can go after the pawn again with, for example, queen a5, queen takes c5, but white is going to use that time to like castle, put rooks in the center of the board, and white just has an amazing position at the cost of a pawn. Black is losing way too much time on development and regaining a pawn on c5. Instead, Reti goes for pawn d5, which is pretty good, but not as good as just capturing. Now, queen b6, going after the b2 pawn. You've probably heard the b2 pawn called the poison pawn, and it's games like this that illustrate why. Simply queen d2, and like Vacher Legrave, we see no hesitation here from Euwe, and he goes queen takes b2. Now, he does have an idea here, a very specific idea that he has calculated, and it's a pretty cool idea. After rook b1, he has prepared the move knight takes d5, which is absolutely the best try in the position and is interesting and cool and clever. Of course, if rook takes b2, then bishop takes c3, and suddenly black is better thanks to the pin right here. So that part is awesome. What's not awesome is after knight takes d5, we get another double rook sacrifice like in the game we just saw. Knight takes d5, giving up the rook on b1, king f2, and queen takes h1. And I have to imagine that at this point, Euwe was not exactly excited about capturing on h1, but was more like, oh, here we go again, because of course this attack is just absolutely deadly. It's already winning for white. Now, I really like bishop takes e7. There are other good moves, other greedy moves like knight c7 check, but this move is the way to continue the attack, the beautiful bishop takes e7. Everything is winning now. There are a lot of lines. I'm not going to show all of them, but I'm going to show some of my favorites. One line is if black tries to run with the king right away with king f7. Of course, you can't castle with the bishop sitting on e7, strapping you in. Now knight g5 check. The king tries to hide on g8. Knight f6 check is now a nice move with the simple idea of clearing out this diagonal here, leading to the king. Bishop takes, bishop c4 check, king g7, and now you can trade on f6. And after king takes f6, there's simply queen f4 check. It's not surprising that this move leads to mate, but the mating line is nice, instructive, and clean. King e7, queen e5 check, precise, pushing the king to the back row. If king d8, there's simply knight f7 checkmate. Beautiful use of the knight. And if the king goes back to f8, then naturally you can capture the rook here. Queen takes h8, king back. You can just go back with queen e5 check, and now because the rook is gone from h8, you can take on h7 with checkmate. So a long but pretty and instructive line. There are more, but I'm just going to give that one after bishop takes on e7. Now, actually played in the game is pawn to d6, simply bishop takes d6, and of course, after bishop takes d6, white is just looking to introduce the queen along the e-file, and you're also looking to get your material back with knight c7 check. Black is up 2 rooks for a knight, but of course, it's not going to be enough. Now, I'm not going to illustrate everything, but my favorite line, my absolute favorite line, and if the game had finished in this way, I think this game would be, you know, like the opera game that we, just a game that we absolutely all knew. So bishop d7, trying to make some room to run over here. And this move does not work because of queen to e3 check, king to d8, queen g5 check, king c8, and now knight e7 check, king d8, knight c6 check, king c8. And I'm sure that you all see this coming. Queen d8 check, brilliant as always. We've seen it before, but it's still brilliant. Rook takes, and knight e7 checkmate. A smothered mate, a beautiful variation on the smothered mate. Again, if the game had finished this way, it's a nice game, but if the game had finished this way, I think that it would be one of the most famous games of all time. Rich stuff. Actually, in the game played is knight c6. Now, the knight is really key here for holding together, for example, these squares where the queen would like to go after invading with a check on the e-file. So that knight on c6 just needs to be eliminated. Bishop b5. And after the knight is defended, you just take it. Bishop takes c6. And this is actually pretty straightforward. Black could capture back with the bishop, which isn't what happens in the game. Queen e3 check, and then the queen is coming in, and we'll just illustrate the very classic checkmate, queen c7, a queen and helper mate. Good stuff. So actually played is pawn takes c6, which is a little less natural to refute, but the line is still pretty straightforward. Queen e2 check. If the king goes to f7, trying to go to the f-file, we'll see knight g5 check, king back to g8, knight e7 check, king f8, and I do like this, knight takes g6 check. I like the position of these mutual knights here. King g8, queen c4 check. The queen on e2 is very well placed to mate both in this line and in the line that happens in the game. Bishop e6 and queen takes e6. Checkmate. In the game, we see the king going the other way, trying to escape on the queen side, but after king d8, we see bishop c7 check. The king only has the c8 square, and now queen a6 is actually checkmate. This move happens on the board in the game to finish the game and the match. And Reti, in the course of 4 games, used 2 double rook sacrifices to win brilliantly. Now, I do want to show you one more game, the 3rd game in the match, the one that Euwe won, but I'm only going to show you the beautiful finish. This game was an absolute barn burner. At this point, Euwe had given up his queen for 2 rooks, and obviously his king looks unsafe, but it is actually Reti's king that proved the more unsafe king. There are a few ways to win this game, but I think we can all really enjoy the path selected by Euwe. Here he goes for rook d to d8. The rooks pile up here on the 8th rank, introducing the threat of rook to a8 checkmate, very effective. And the point is that if the knight captures here on d8, then there's bishop to d4 check. And one way or another, black's queen is falling. For example, of course, if b6, then bishop takes b6, supported by the knight on a4 is a fork, winning the queen, straightforward enough. But also, for example, you could consider king to b8, then there's bishop to e5 with a classic pin. And you could also look at the move king to a8, but then there's knight to b6 check. And if the king goes here, you still have your pin. And if the king goes to a7, you have a discovered check. It's a really beautiful combination of multiple fine chess tactics. So after rook d to d8, we actually see the move pawn to b6 from Reti here, trying to fend off checkmate, obviously, and also trying to close off some of these dark squares. Now we get bishop to a3, an excellent move that's helping support attacks along the 7th rank. For example, if knight takes d8 here or later, then you have rook e7 because the bishop on a3 is helping out. So after bishop a3, we see pawn takes h2, which doesn't really change much. The king goes to h1, and black is really struggling for a move here. Maybe one move you could try is pawn to a5, giving your king a little more room and not really doing much because you can't do very much. If you move the knight, you're going to get pinned down here. The queen also needs to stop mates with rook d7. So it's a position where you can't find good options for Reti. Reti settled on the move queen f7, which looks like a very good try. Of course, if you aren't paying attention and you don't see the finish that is anticipated here, then queen f1 is going to lead to a perpetual check. So what is the right finish? I definitely pause your video and take a moment to look for it if you haven't seen it yet. It is the excellent rook to e7. Very, very beautiful, brilliant move. Now, of course, the queen and king are forked right here, so you must take the rook. But after knight takes e7, there is rook d7 check, and it's death along the 7th rank. Supposedly in this position, Reti resigned, but sometimes the finishing moves are given as part of the game. Whether the king goes back to a8 or to b8, either way you get basically the same bishop and knight checkmate combination. The question is only which pieces are checking first. I guess most pretty would be king to b8, but the moves that I've seen given as the most likely finish, if this wasn't resignation, would be king a8, knight takes b6 check, king over to b8, and then the beautiful bishop to d6 checkmate. Very, very beautiful stuff. You can't ask for more in a 4-game match. I did cheat and I covered 3 out of these 4 games as my 9th best chess game of the 1920s, but I think that you can understand why they're all from one match. And the first 2 that we looked at share this incredible double rook sacrifice theme that is so enjoyable. It's crazy to me that in 2 games from one 4-game match, you would have double rook sacrifices. That's just insane. In any case, if you want to see more of my favorite games from the 1920s, then simply click on that playlist that is popping up on your screen as I speak.